Thank you, Mike. Hello, my name is Thijs van Massakers. I'm an assistant professor in city and regional planning here in the Knowlton School. And tonight it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Michael Seth Wexler, coming to us from the Copenhagenize Design Company. For those of you who don't know me and are regulars to the Baumer lecture series, I am not Curtis Roth. And I cannot wax eloquently about things like the slippery and slightly transgressive nature of the letter X. Unfortunately, Curtis, I still think about the letter X since you used it in your intro. I do, however, want to take a few minutes to contextualize the relationship between Copenhagenize, the city and regional planning program here at the Knowlton School, and Michael, our speaker for tonight. So every year, or at least many years, Professor Lara from City and Regional Planning visits Copenhagen as part of his May study abroad trip, and as a part of that visit, he also attends or goes to Copenhagenize headquarters. So as a result of that emerging relationship, we thought it was important to bring the firm here to all of us in Central Ohio. But having said that, and giving you a bit of context for the importance of that relationship, you might realize, for those of you that know me, that it's a little awkward for me to stand up here and sort of argue for Copenhagen as the world's cycling capital, because of course I am from Amsterdam. I am Dutch, which is not Danish, in case you didn't know that. So this instills in me the obligation to think and talk of Amsterdam and not Copenhagen as the epicenter of all things cycling. So the first key difference between Amsterdam and Copenhagen is the successful transformation of that city's name into a verb. To Copenhagenize is an elegant and dynamic neologism. In the Netherlands, the most famous attempt to convert Amsterdam into a captivating neologism is actually the title of a 1988 horror movie, Amsterdam. Very unfortunate. It's an unfortunate movie as well. So it's probably just a coincidence, although I'm not sure, that our speaker tonight actually worked in filmmaking in Toronto, Canada, and after a stint as an exchange student in film and philosophy at the University of Copenhagen, I do wonder, and maybe this is for the Q&A, whether or not Michael has seen Amsterdam, which I can assure you I've seen many times. Second key difference between Copenhagen and Amsterdam is that the star player in the Dutch soccer team that won the 1988 Euro Cup was an elegant striker, Marco van Basten. Whereas the star on the Danish team that won the 1992 Euro Cup was Peter Schmeichel. Denmark beat the Netherlands that year, unfortunately, but perhaps more relevantly to tonight is that both Denmark and the Netherlands beat Germany in the run-up to those two events, and yes, Michael also lived and worked in Berlin, Germany, again working primarily in the area of film. The final and perhaps the most relevant difference between Copenhagen and Amsterdam became evident at last week's Cycling World Championships, where the Netherlands gathered an impressive 8 medals across all categories compared to Denmark's 2. But the point of Copenhagenize's work, as I assume Michael will explain tonight, is actually to distinguish clearly and consistently between the lycra-clad competitive cycling of that event and those like it on the one hand, and the cycling as a form of transportation on the other. Dating back to the early beginnings of the Copenhagenize approach was the blog and now the Instagram feed, Cycle Chic. If you haven't checked it out, you should. This features images of urban cyclists dressed for your destination, not your journey. It is this motto, dress for your destination, not for your journey, that of course brings cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen together. Michael joined the Copenhagenize Design Company in 2015 after completing a graduate degree in city planning from McGill University in Montreal. From his Montreal headquarters of the North American office of Copenhagenize, he oversees planning projects from Detroit to the city of Long Beach, California. Most recently, the firm has done work with the city of Akron, Ohio, so perhaps a last suggestion for a question for the Q&A would be whether or not Michael has met LeBron James. Please join me in welcoming to the Knowlton School, Michael Seth Wexler.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for the Knowlton School for having me. So as you'll notice right off the bat, hearing my accent, I am not Danish. So I'm Canadian. I'm from French Canada, from Montreal. I'm an urban designer based out of Montreal, I guess by way of Berlin and Copenhagen and other places I've explored and fallen in love with. and have been back in Montreal for about 3 years now, running our North American studio as a North American, hopefully trying to inspire more North Americans to why it matters that we care at all about these cities that we're talking about, Copenhagen and Amsterdam. So we're going to talk about bicycle urbanism today, and bicycle urbanism by design. So who are we? What is Copenhagenize Design Company? We alluded to this just before. Started originally by our founder, Michael Colville-Anderson, in about 2007, 2009 as a blog, a series of blogs, Cycle Chic and Copenhagenize. And the idea was to try to talk to the world about why we should Copenhagenize, why we should understand what simple design elements are happening for normal transport, and use the bicycle as that tool to bring that around the world. So what we do as the firm started in about 2011, and it's grown into 4 satellite offices around the world, headquartered out of Copenhagen, all of our North American work here in Montreal, as well as Brussels and Barcelona, so that we can do work in French language countries and Spanish language countries. And we generally try to focus on 3 areas. So I'll jump to the last of the 3 first, research and education. So this is born out of who we were as this blog to start, wanting to talk about what is all the high-level research that's happening around the world with regard to cycling, with regard to urban cycling, normal cycling, and how do we educate people around the world? How do we talk about this? How do we disseminate this information to people on all continents across the globe? Otherwise, we do work, more standard planning work and design with cities, working on full citywide bicycle strategies, neighborhood development plans with regard to the bicycle, and street level designs as well. And then we work on communications projects. So we're working right now, for example, with the city of Strasbourg in France to basically develop a wayfinding strategy for their cycle superhighway network, essentially a suburban highway network route that they're developing. So some of the work, I'm not going to stay on this for too long. I more want to talk about why this matters, but some of the work that we've been doing around the world in the last few years, like was mentioned before, we've been working on the greater downtown bicycle network strategy for the city of Detroit, as well as a network strategy here in Ohio and Akron, as well as a number of other projects, whether they are campaigns like things that have been done in Copenhagen or otherwise. We often welcome a lot of people to Copenhagen and take them on tours. We've had countless delegations come through over the years, and we're constantly busy, or the Copenhagen office is more busy. I wish I was more busy in Copenhagen giving tours on a daily basis, because it's a lot of fun. But we're doing that quite regularly. So let's get down into the crux of what I want to talk about. So our focus is the streets. The streets are the skeletal structure of the city organism. We see cities as these growing, evolving, ever-changing organisms, and so we want to focus on those arteries, the skeletal structure. And we know from anthropology that urbanism and settlements have existed for 10 to 7,000 years, and streets were always these democratic spaces. They were always these places where people played. Yes, people transported themselves, but people fell in love. They saw their friends. They went to the market. These were places where city life happened. They were the agoras. And we hear this all the time in our work, but I'm sure you guys have all heard it as well. Well, you know, this bicycle-friendly thing, you know, the hipsters are riding, and oh, you know, maybe the poor person's going to take a bicycle. You hear all these things all over the place about what bicycle-friendly is. And this isn't something new. Cities were once bicycle-friendly. We have tons of photographic and map evidence from around the world, and yes, even in North America, that cities were bicycle-friendly. We have cop brigades that were all on bikes as a normal thing. We have riding groups. We have kids going to school by bicycle in the morning. This was a normal form of transport. We see it in maps. So this map here is from my fair city of Montreal, Canada, and this is a bicycle network map from 1897. Yeah, we were talking about bicycle networks in 1897. So what we do is not novel. We're just trying to remind people that this has existed, this conversation has existed for a very long time. Detroit, Motor City, America. This city, the downtown, was literally paved for the bicycle. You had wood that was a material being used to create streets which eventually, once the bicycle came onto the scene, wood didn't work quite so well. It was quite bumpy. So we literally started paving Motor City America for the bicycle. That's a pretty stark piece of history that should show us that the bicycle matters in our history to some degree. So what happened? Well, we all know the rise of the automobile. This is a photo, I believe it was from a World Expo in the 30s or 40s, and this was sort of an image of the future. This was, towers in the sky, highways everywhere, but at the end of the day, does this look that different from a lot of what's been built over the last 50 to 70 years? No. And arguably, the greatest paradigm shift in the history of our cities happened around the 40s and 50s. Suddenly, the streets were no longer this place where human life just happened. It was rather a place that needed to be efficient, and it needed to be efficient for one mode, for the car. This wasn't just a natural change. This was a concerted effort by auto lobby to actually institute new concepts that didn't exist before so that the streets could be used for that only utilitarian purpose, only for cars. If you think that jaywalking is something that's just existed since the dawn of time, you're wrong. Jaywalking was literally a constructed concept by the auto lobby. A jay was a country bumpkin who didn't understand the highfalutin way of city life. And so if you were a jaywalker, you were just like ambling, crossing the street wherever you wanted, like everybody did for thousands of years. And now suddenly the car was here, and you could not get in the way of the car. How dare you play in the streets? You have to cross on a crosswalk. You can't cross diagonally. We have to keep people in order so that the car can function. So one thing that we try to do, like I said at Copenhagenize, is the communications and education aspect. And so we try to distill these larger historical conversations into bite-sized memes, because we know this is how things travel around the world and the internet these days. So this is one of our favorites, and it's called A Brief History of Traffic Engineering. So let's start in the 1800s. Point A to point B, direct transport for your feet and your horse. That's how you got around. Those were your transport networks. 1900s, we start to see some early technological inventions. We see early public transport. They're not completely direct. It's a bit awkward how you get from point A to point B. They don't fully work. But the bicycle was very, very prominent on the scene, and it was direct A to B connection. The 20s, we start to see the beginning of the automobile. And again, it's a bit awkward at the beginning. Ford's first invention was the quadricycle, which was made of bicycle parts, another fun fact. But at the beginning, at the invention of the car, it was a bit awkward. But still, you had direct A to B connections for pedestrians, for bicycles, and for public transport, for trams and buses, early buses at that time. And we look at the 50s to now, and we've done this entire role reversal, where the only direct A to B connection is for the car. Our public transport networks are loop-de-loops that eventually get you to where you want to go. And it's hard to even say that for bikes and pedestrians that we have networks. They're essentially just these concatenations of lines that don't necessarily even go anywhere. So the thing that gives me and my colleagues and other people we work with a little bit of hope, and I hope it would give you guys some hope as well, is that there's another shift happening. And really, we can see it since 2004, 2005. There's something changing in political rhetoric in a lot of cities around the world. So this is a quote I always really like to put up on the screen. The fact is that automobiles no longer have a place in the big cities of our time. Yes, it's a big statement. I'm not saying this is exactly what everybody should follow, but it's interesting to know who said this, because I think that kind of shows that something is shifting. Can anybody guess what city this person would have come from to make a big, bold statement like this? Just shout it out. New York? London? Okay, I was expecting to get more responses like, oh, a little Dutch or Danish town. That's what we usually get. But anyway, you were on the right path. It's the mayor of Paris, the most arguably car-oriented European city of 12 million people, congested, terrible air. This is the mayor of Paris saying, we need to change. It's enough. This cannot be our future. We're at peak car. Because we're at a point where we have to change the question, because we have no other option. We're at peak car. We're at a point where we cannot build our way out of congestion. We can't build our way out of obesity. We can't do what we want to do by just building more. We have to change the way that we're thinking about this. So this is the model that we've been employing since the 50s. This is what the majority of the Federal Highway Administration standards are based on, something called level of service. And the question that a traffic engineer is asked is, how many cars can you fit down this street? If it's more, it gets a higher grade. If it's less, it gets a lower grade. So which means if you suddenly are able to move a ton of bikes and a ton of public transport and a ton of pedestrians, it's irrelevant. It's getting a low score because you're going to damage vehicle throughput. So if we change the question to how many people can we move down the street, irrespective of the mode, we know that we can increase capacity up to 10-fold. There's a lot of studies that have shown us this. So changing that question is how we have to move forwards. And a little bit of positive news is that the FHWA in the last couple of years has started to acknowledge that this is something that can be measured. I just think it's going to take some time until the powers that be start doing that more regularly. So another way of looking at this, again, on the meme side of things, basic urban math congestion busting Copenhagen style. So this is an intersection in Copenhagen. And when people tell you, oh, those damn bikes are creating congestion, oh, the bus is stopped in front of me, it's creating congestion. What's creating congestion? Generally, in these cars, you have one, maybe two people. Maybe there's occasionally a carpool or a ride share. But for the most part, look at the space efficiency differences between bikes, public transport, and cars. So we like to say, this is the model for traffic planning in the 21st century. This is what a modern city does from a traffic planning perspective. And I'll explain this. You make getting around by bike super easy, point A to point B. Same thing for pedestrians, same thing for public transport. And this is contentious. Make driving a pain in the ass. Because if you don't do that, where's that space coming from? You have to change the paradigm. So, what are we actually talking about to get out of some of the high-level philosophy stuff? Well, we're talking about the bicycle. And of course, there's a ton of other great work that needs to be done, especially in the public transport space and for how we walk around our cities and placemaking and parks and greenery and all this other great stuff. But I want to focus on talking about cycling. It's what we focus on in our work. So we really believe that the bicycle is this really powerful, transformative tool to redesign our streets and our cities. But as it was alluded to before, we're not talking about cycling for sport. We're talking about cycling for transport, for the 99%, for the demographic that isn't cycling today that could be. There have been a number of replicated studies around the world and a lot in North America that show that usually there is 4 general groups of your types of cyclists or potential cyclists. You'll have 30%, give or take, depending on the city, but usually somewhere in there. 30% that say no way, no how. I'm not getting on a bike. Either I have mobility issues, I don't want to get out of my car. Fair. A third of people. But then we have the small percentage, it's usually 1 in 5, that will be the really intense cyclists, the road warriors. They'll ride under any condition. They'll ride, on a highway. They don't care. They just want to be on their bike. You'll have the 5% that will ride under most conditions, but again, they don't really care about the infrastructure. Of course, they'd be happier. But what we see is the largest contingent, it's usually around 2/3 of the population, say that they're interested but they're concerned. Why are they concerned? Safety, connectivity, reliability, all the things that we know we want in our life in transport. So we know that latent demand exists and we have to fill it. And it's important for us to understand what a bicycle is, because this is something that's vastly misunderstood. When you're planning for the bicycle is not a vehicle. Since, I believe, the 70s or so in the US and in Canada, the bicycle legislatively has been considered a vehicle, and we've been planning for the bicycle as if it takes a whole lane, it turns in the left lane like cars. The bicycle's not a vehicle. It's a fast-moving pedestrian. It's a squishy thing. It doesn't have a big metal box. It's much closer to a pedestrian than a car. So, now let's get to Copenhagen. Why does this matter? Why is this our reference point, and why am I talking to you about this today? Well, first of all, this is a photo that I took on my commute when I worked out of our Copenhagen office in the morning. So people know Copenhagen as this beautiful, dreamlike land where just all these blonde people are riding their bicycles with their long legs into the Nordic sunrise and sunset. These gorgeous images, you have Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales playing in your head on an audiobook or whatever. And even the logo from the city of Copenhagen, it's I Bike CPH. It's inspired by the I Love New York. It's like the bicycle is part of our heart. But this is advertising. This is marketing. They did a really good job of marketing it because you bought all that. But that's not the reality. This is the reality of the city. So these are the faces of people that ride in the morning. Does she look happy? Her kid kept her up, she didn't sleep, she didn't have her coffee, she didn't have the grounds at home, whatever. She's on her bike because she has to, because it's the best way to get from point A to point B. The bicycle is not fetishized. The bicycle isn't thought of this dreamlike thing for Copenhageners. The bicycle is a vacuum cleaner. The bicycle is a sewing machine. The logo should be I vacuum clean Copenhagen, because essentially the bicycle is your tool. It's not something that you show off to your friends. You basically just store it away when you're done. You use it for the function that it needs to give you in your life, and then you put it away. You don't go to the bar and talk about your bike with your friends. Copenhageners don't. They just take the bike, get to the bar, and talk about their life. It's just a tool. And when we ask Copenhageners, the city asks them every single year through the Danish Technical University, why do you ride a bicycle? And the answer every single year, the predominant majority is, it's quick, it's efficient, it makes sense. Of course, there's a small percentage that says, I do it for exercise. And then even less people that say, it's inexpensive, because of course it is. But notice that, a tiny contingent say, I want to save a polar bear by riding my bicycle. Of course, I'm not saying that I'm not for sustainability. Of course I'm for sustainability. Of course I'm for the environment. But that's not how you market it. You don't tell people, you ride a bicycle, you're going to save the environment, and they go, okay, I'm going to do that now. That's not how it works. And we see from Copenhagen as an example that it's about efficiency, it's about convenience in a person's life. And this is why they're riding. So this is a scene from a regular morning commute. This is the world's busiest bicycle street in the world. Sorry, Netherlands. 45,000 bikes every single day on Queen Louise's Bridge here. And 86% of the traffic that goes through this corridor every single day are bicycles. Of course, this is not every single street in Copenhagen. The numbers are still very substantial, but this is why we're inspired by the city. Some numbers, so we can understand Copenhagen a little better and cycling in Copenhagen and contextualize it. So the regional Copenhagen area, the third most sprawling municipality in Europe, so it's not just this tiny little dense European city, 2.5 million people, 42% of people ride every single day as their mode of transportation. Central Copenhagen, about 650,000 people. It is definitely a denser European core. 62% of people ride for work or for education. 75% of those people ride through the whole winter. The modal split from the last bicycle account, which comes out every 2 years from the city, which looks at a ton of different cycling data, surveys, counts, all these different things, infrastructure spending. So the latest number from the city, 62% of people ride a bicycle as the mode of transportation. 21% of people take buses and the metro and the regional trains. 8% of people walk, and 9% of people drive. And that's not even breaking down also ride shares and things like that. So the single occupant vehicle rate in the city of Copenhagen is very low. And they've done an amazing job of being able to show that change over a 40-plus year period. So essentially, a lot of the change, and we'll get into this in a minute, a lot of the change in Copenhagen and other parts of Denmark and the Netherlands and other parts of Northern Europe, we see this change that really started in the 1970s with the oil crisis. And we see that this was this is data that comes from the city. Essentially, they looked at two rings of the city, the outer ring, the municipal border, and then they call it the lakes ring because there's some lakes that sort of form a half ring. So they built a ring of bicycle counters and car counters so that they could compare for 40 years, a huge longitudinal survey about how many bikes, how many cars do we have, and by doing the outside and the inside, they could tell, is this just people leaving and coming in differently, or is this actually a shift in the modal share in the city? And this is data from the inner ring, and you can actually see in 2016, the number of bikes in the city surpassed the number of cars, which was a huge feat for the city. And what does that look like from a financial perspective? Well, of course the city has invested. So the city, and not just the city, also a whole bunch of local charities and government grants from the national level, have invested $300 million in Danish crowns between 2006 and 2017, give or take. So some people might go, wow, that's a lot of money. $30 million a year. It's about comparable to my city, to Montreal's cycling budget, to many other cities' cycling budgets around the world. But they spent that money on infrastructure, on dedicated, protected, connected infrastructure. And the amazing thing is the return. you will never find an infrastructural project that has a return on investment like cycling infrastructure. This literally brought in it to society, not directly to the city, to society through different means, over $200 million per year. So that's a huge return on your investment. And there have been some enormous cost-benefit analyses that have been done in Copenhagen by this is the first one, the data from the first one, a big engineering firm called Covey. And essentially they were looking at a multitude of factors. They were looking at time lost because of health, by driving, trying to look at the degradation of the road and the costs for that with regard to cycling versus cars. All these different factors in these huge societal cost-benefit analyses showing that actually for every kilometer cycled, society gains 65 cents and society loses 71 cents for every kilometer driven. And more numbers to show that this just works is that we know from countless studies that almost 6,000 people per hour can go down a standard Copenhagen-style cycle track that's usually about 8 feet minimum width in one direction, so it kind of has a fast and a slow lane, and then your car lane, which can fit about 1,300 cars. And good luck trying to get all of those cars to share so that you can bump that number up. Maybe some, but ultimately the numbers don't lie here. So Copenhagen wasn't always Copenhagen, and this is something that I always really try to stress, especially when we're talking in North America, because the result that we get all the time is, well, that's there, this is here. It's never going to happen. And if you would have said that to a Copenhagener, and probably many Dutch people as well, in the 60s, in the 50s, oh, well, you know, what do you think about people cycling everywhere? They're like, well, I can't see it. Like, our city streets are just clogged with motorized vehicles. This is a square in the city center called Gameltor, which essentially was a parking lot in the 60s. And that's the square today. That's concerted effort and work on the part of the city through design to change that. This is a bike pedestrian only street now. This is actually, it was the original home of Søren Kierkegaard, which is a really famous Danish philosopher, so it's an important tourist destination. And then there's food stands, there's a fountain, there's a market on certain days, there's ample bike parking, and it actually has life on the streets now. This street, can anybody guess which street this is from the 60s? You guessed it, same street today. So, let's talk about design a little bit. How am I doing on time? Okay. So, we are called Copenhagenize Design Company. It's something we really care about. It's something that we think needs to be talked about more, especially in the urban planning realm, because design means intentionality. Design means having a focus and having a direction, and yes, maybe having a bias, but having a choice that you make in the work that you do. And this is what we can see through the example of Copenhagen. It's asking yourself, what kind of city do I want to live in, and building for that. Do you want to see a city with cars everywhere? Great. 4 lanes in each direction, flyovers. Yeah, the cars will come because you'll make it easy to drive. If you want to see kids riding to school, if you want to see all ages and abilities cycling, somebody wearing whatever they want on their bicycle, able to do it feeling safe. You know, we run anthropological studies sometimes, and we'll actually look at how many people are smoking a cigarette on their bike. How many people are like holding their partner's hand riding side by side? How many people are on their cell phone, which is, you know, it's not allowed. But that's a sign that people are feeling safe because they've been built for. They've been thought of because the question's been asked, what kind of city do I want to live in? By the people that are designing and planning the infrastructure. And so we asked, what if we used basic design principles? And Denmark, being a land of design, very well known for furniture and lighting and other things like that, and bike infrastructure, asking if we actually applied that and not just engineering standards, not just dogma, not just what we need to copy and paste, but actually this understanding of basic design principles to our roads, to our city streets, what would we get? Would we be able to design it much like we design a product for users? So let's look at 3 elements. Well, when you design something, you want it to be intuitive. So all of these chairs that you're sitting on, you didn't need to read a manual when you walked in today. You just knew, okay, this opens and my bum goes here. That serves a function. So it's intuitive. Secondly, it's encouraging. You wanted to sit, the chair helped you sit. It encouraged you to facilitate some function in your life. And then thirdly, it's desirable. I mean, the product needs to be elegant. It needs to be sexy. It needs to draw you in, because otherwise, you're going to go to something else. So what if we tried to reinvent the chair? What if we forgot about those principles and we said, oh, let's just like try to completely reinvent the wheel and completely come up with something super innovative. Let's like just tech this out. Let's put sensors everywhere on the chair. What does it lead to? Does this look like a cycling map of a lot of our cities? Yeah, I mean, it looks like a chair, but you stand? No, if you stand, you'll fall. If you sit, you'll fall. It doesn't really serve a function. So we need to try to understand what the thing looks like and what the function is and be drawn to use it. So let's look at some examples. So is this designed? This is an example from Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. This is a two-way cycle track that runs down the middle of a very busy street. And we always ask ourselves, was this designed? Is it intuitive that you're on the sidewalk with your bike because you're coming out of a destination? You're like, okay, so I have to somehow frogger across 3 lanes of traffic to get there, and then I can get on my bike, but there's bikes going past, so I don't know where I get on my bike. Okay, and then I'm supposed to read a bunch of stuff. Okay, so that's really intuitive. Secondly, is it encouraging? No, it's just flat out no. I don't want to go there with kids. It's not encouraging to help me with that function, and I honestly don't find it desirable. I don't find it attractive either. This is my city. This is Montreal, and I'm sure you all know bike lanes like this everywhere. The plain Jane bike lane, as we call it. It is putting a squishy, vulnerable thing on 2 wheels between 2 metal boxes, one that moves really fast and one that has swinging doors. So had the person in the room designing this said that, they would have been, okay, maybe we shouldn't put it there. But instead, it was built on engineering standards, and this was just leftover space. Let's give it to the bikes. They'll figure it out. How about the Sharrow? Does everybody know the dreaded Sharrow? So this is, for those that don't know, the share arrow. It's essentially a traffic engineering telling bikes, share the road. Is that design? So, how does design work in a Copenhagen context? And context here is the word that's key. Trying to understand what does that street need, but not overcomplicating it, not trying to reinvent the wheel. So we have the wheel of infrastructure, the context wheel of infrastructure we call the Copenhagenize Bicycle Planning Guide. 4 contexts for every necessary type of bicycle infrastructure that you'll find throughout Denmark, and for the most part, Netherlands really follows a very similar guide to this. And essentially, let's walk through them quickly so that we can understand them. So the first quadrant here, essentially you'll see the 2 factors that play into the context are speed, so not just posted speed that you'll see on the sign, but design speed, how fast are people actually able to go, and volume, how many cars are moving down the street per day. So the first context is essentially a shared environment, low speeds, low volumes. Then we're talking painted lanes, a little bit higher speeds, higher volumes. We're getting to significant speeds, significant volumes, protected lanes, and then we're getting to buffered and protected far away lanes. So let's actually see what they look like. So shared space, these are all Copenhagen examples, but these are examples that in our work we can still establish this around the world because these design principles are still transferable. So for example, this is a road. You have very few cars that pass through here. It's not a cut through that's necessary to get from an arterial to an arterial. It's people's homes, and the speed cannot be elevated because there's all these things in the way. Informal chicanes and little barbecue areas. This is really where a street can be a shared street. So we see bad examples of this in a lot of North American cities these days where they're being called bicycle boulevards. So it's this really wide right-of-way, often 12-foot lanes, which is like you could fit almost a bus and a car in that. And essentially, you're putting down a logo that says, share the road. Well, this is a real shared space because the context is right. So we go up in context to the second piece. So this is a painted lane in a Copenhagen context. And a painted lane will always be between the curb and the drive lane. And that is because we are closer to pedestrians than we are to cars on a bicycle. And we're more vulnerable. So if you want to take your kid on a street like this that has a painted lane because of the context, you can let your kid, if they're really young, ride on the sidewalk and you ride next to them. They can get off quickly if they're not feeling safe. It allows for a human way of using that street as infrastructure. Sometimes you'll also see a buffer here, sort of wider area for dooring zone. This is a bit of a narrower street, but always next to the curb. So then when we get higher speeds and higher volumes, and this is a more northern portion of that busy bicycle street I showed you guys before, we'll get to the cycle track. And the cycle track is really the main basic building block, the Lego piece, if you will, of the Copenhagen cycling infrastructure network. Because essentially here you have 3 levels of sidewalk. You have the pedestrian sidewalk, which steps down to the bicycle sidewalk, which steps down to the roadway. And here everybody has their own delineated space. But then in North America, we're seeing different versions of the protected bike lane, as it's sometimes called, or the cycle track. And this can be designed in many different ways. But again, higher speeds, higher volumes, you protect. And then we get to the buffered cycle track. And this is really high speeds, really high volumes, things like motorways. And at a bare minimum, this is an absolute minimum, have some real division between the cars and the bikes. Sometimes you'll let the bikes go 2 ways because there's no intersections, which can be problematic. And in situations like this, the roadway is so big and impossible to cross that 2 ways on one side makes sense. Or you have these paths going through parks and completely away from the roads. And the thing to take away from the design and the context in infrastructure in Copenhagen is that it's designed so that you can be inherently social. And it's based on this human-centered design that recognizes that transport is social. So all of the cycle tracks at a bare minimum will have, very, very minimum will be 7 feet in width, generally 8 to 9, and then sometimes even up to 13, 14 feet on the really busy bicycle corridors. And why is that? Because of something that the city of Copenhagen calls conversation cycling. It's not illegal to ride 2 abreast because the recognition is if this is a mode of transport, you are a social creature as a human. You need to be social while you transport yourself. You talk to your friend on the way home from school, on the way home from work. You ride with your kid next to you on the way to school in the morning. And the cycling infrastructure has to be sufficiently wide and safe for 2 people to ride next to each other, with a third, often even cargo bike, a wider bike, to pass you on the left. So I always use the analogy, what if the cars were forced to be designed like fighter jets, and everybody had to just be like right behind in front of each other in the same vehicle? We would find that ridiculous because, we always want to have a passenger. We want to talk to somebody in our cars. So why aren't we applying that to bicycle infrastructure? And that's what Copenhagen does. And the other reason we're very inspired by the design of the city is that there's all these other elements that are human-centered pieces that really make sure that we are designing for people and not just to get around, but in all of the different ways you need to use the infrastructure. So these little pieces that we call micro-design. So this example is a tilted garbage can. So you ride in the morning and you have your coffee cup and you want to throw it out and you don't want to spill on yourself, and maybe you try to throw it in the garbage can but you miss. The city actually noticed a huge pile of garbage by a lot of the garbage cans. So they're like, why don't we do some sort of iterative design and just try to angle them by the cycle track? And they did, and people are gamifying it all the time. Another piece I really love is the foot and the armrest. And you'll see this at a lot of the major intersections, and there's a lot of really interesting anthropological elements that come out of this piece of design because, we've all heard, these damn cyclists, they don't stop at red lights. Whether or not that's true, whether or not there's data that backs that up, we know that concept exists in society. So to fight that from a purely marketing perspective, why don't we give a thing for cyclists to actually be comfortable at, to promote waiting at the red light, to promote the behavior we want to see instead of scolding and then wondering what's happened. So you'll see these all over the city, and these footrests are really cool because there's opportunities for marketing. So here, this is the city's super cycle highway, sort of suburban bike network that's being advertised there. And then you're seeing these pop up all around the world now. Montreal's just put in a bunch of these. You'll see them in Minneapolis, in Chicago. They're quite comfortable, so you don't have to get off your saddle at a light. And then the other pieces of information are macro design. These big pieces of infrastructure that connect pieces that really need a small, half-mile, quarter-mile connection. So this is called the bicycle snake, the cykelslanghe in Danish. And essentially it connects on the south end, since there is a sea harbor that goes through the city of Copenhagen, it connects the first ever bicycle pedestrian-only bridge, which was built in, I believe, 2008, which is just below down here. It used to be that you would get off the bicycle pedestrian bridge and you'd have all these wharfs that you'd have to sort of kind of walk, kind of ride your bike, and there's stairs, and it took forever and it was not good for bicycles at all. And so they said, why don't we build this small connection that really just increases the efficiency for this small piece? And they were expecting maybe 10,000 bikes would use it a day. I think it's used by almost 25,000 bikes a day now. So huge effects with pieces of a macro design like this. And then talking more about playful design, talking about things like what we call the green wave. So for many years in cities around the world, our traffic engineers have been linking up green lights at a certain speed for cars so that you can drive through that area, no problem, at a certain speed if you're in a car, and get that green wave all the way into work in the morning and out at the end of the day. And they said, well, why don't we just do that for bikes, but we'll do it at like slower speeds that work for bikes, and we'll gamify it. So here on this stretch, which sort of sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, unfortunately, near the University of Copenhagen, you essentially, if you see the green lights, you know you've caught the wave. And so you ride on it, you know you're going to get the green light at the next light, but if it starts going out, you literally have to speed up to catch that green wave and vice versa. So it's a really, really interesting regulating force and playing with the infrastructure. Another thing to get people to want to cycle, because it's fun. So one thing that we hear all the time is, but my city's too cold, my city's too hilly, my city's too hot, people won't ride. And the thing about design is that by thinking about what a person needs and being able to build for that, like we're building a product, we can seduce them to use it. Of course, we're not saying everybody's going to ride through the winter, but with a well-built system and good maintenance, we can have huge numbers like we see in Copenhagen. With new inventions that we're having now, like the e-bike, we can essentially make hills irrelevant. There's all these things that are happening on the level of design and more from a product-focused perspective, where we can start to not see these issues as issues, but transcend them. So in Copenhagen, what happens on first snowfall is that you have these little machines that are just buzzing back and forth. First priority streets are the streets with bicycle infrastructure. And they have a policy that first thing in the morning, there has to be black asphalt. So if it snows throughout the whole night, they will go back and forth 3 times so that you can trust that the bicycle infrastructure is always available for you to use. Of course, there's always little blips. There's always the occasional situation where there's a huge snowstorm and maybe you have to wait a couple hours. But essentially, all bicycle users are intermodal citizens too. So if your bike breaks down one day, you take a bus. But generally, the system is always there and functional for you. So this is a picture I will leave you on Copenhagen with a picture of all of the streets in central Copenhagen that have protected cycle tracks on both sides of the street. Like we saw in that picture before, that's the one in orange. And the one in blue are all of the streets that are priority snow-cleared corridors throughout the winter. It's the same thing, because at the end of the day, if it's not a reliable network, people are not going to use it. So that's where I'm going to put a pin in Copenhagen, since I've been talking about Copenhagen for a while. And I'm going to sort of end off talking about some of the things we're seeing around the world in some of the work that we do that I do find really inspiring and shows us that we're getting past the point of having to just talk about Copenhagen and Amsterdam again, because it's not about them anymore. They have been doing it for 40 or 50 years. We can learn, and we are learning from them. But it's about, we call the zeros to heroes. The cities that were doing nothing 5 years ago, and there was nobody cycling, and the data showed it, and they suddenly did some of these things, and we're really starting to see that build it and they will come situation. So every 2 years we do something called the Copenhagenize Index, which is probably the biggest project that we do. This was from 2017, so we're actually just about, I guess in a month or two, starting our next research phase for 2019. We spent about 3 or 4 months across all 4 of our offices researching 160 cities of 600,000 people or more around the world, and then ranking them based on 14 different parameters. So it's the largest, most comprehensive cycling index in the world, and you know, we tend to get quoted as sort of the index to look to understand what's happening, because we look at things that are more than just modal share and kilometers of infrastructure and these sort of hard numbers. So we look at what is happening in the political sphere. So what kind of movements is the political environment making for cycling-focused policies? Is there a bicycle office in the actual city government that's actually managing this stuff? It's not just getting swept up in the engineering department or in the planning department, but they actually have a voice. Sometimes it's bikes and pedestrians. A new one we just added this last index in 2017 is cargo bike logistics. So what's happening with cargo bikes? Because cargo bikes, essentially the SUV of the bicycle kingdom, we see huge effects, especially in cities like Copenhagen and a lot of Northern European cities, starting in North America. You see, I believe it's 2 out of 3 families with 2 kids or more have a cargo bike in Copenhagen. There's like 45,000 cargo bikes across the city. It's a really amazing thing. So looking at all these factors can really start to give us a picture of who are the cities that are doing interesting things, and also creating a bit of like a friendly competition around the world. So like, hey, I want to be better than them. We're going to like really invest. So that's the goal of this project. So I'm going to introduce just a few of the cities that we've been really inspired by, and then I think we'll probably wrap into some questions. So Paris, like we mentioned before, their new mayor has been doing some amazing work. It's a huge city, 12 million people. And the bike share system there was one of the first most successful bike share systems. They've now gone into their second phase, and they're having huge numbers of usership, ridership. And then they've also been systematically taking really important streets, a lot of streets right along the Seine, the river that runs through Paris, and basically saying, you know what? We're going to cut out half the traffic from here, and we're going to put in a bike lane. It's not always the best. Sometimes it's a 2-way cycle track on the street, which doesn't really fit best practice, but at least it's getting people to understand cycling, connect them in a safe way, and get them out. And you're starting to see that change, especially in the political environment. Seville. Seville, I think, is one of the most interesting cities to look at or visit if you have a chance. Essentially, in the last decade, they went from almost 0% cycling to somewhere in like 7 or 8%. The modal share has just increased tremendously in such a short period of time. And why is that? It's because they literally just built a network overnight. They just put it down on the ground. It's not the best design again. Some of the lanes are really narrow. You have these like weird posts that are, kind of scary that you might run into because they're metal too. But at the same time, it still creates a protected space that's connected, that's actually a network that gets you from destination to destination across the city. And they've seen that in their results. And the city of Oslo. The city of Oslo has been incredibly inspiring because this is a city that is the capital of Norway, that is a country that loves their oil, that loves their cars, that's very hilly as a city, that's very cold and gets a lot of snow. So a lot of the dissenting folk will be like, people will never cycle in Oslo. Those numbers have been shooting up like crazy. They've built an intermodal system for skiing through the city's public transport system and connected that to bike infrastructure. They have basically created a guide that they call the Oslo Standard that essentially goes against the national government that says, we don't like your standards. They're 1950s engineering focused. We want these standards that were largely inspired by the Copenhagen model, and they're just doing it. They're just basically taking out hundreds of car parking spots along important corridors and doing really, really concentrated marketing efforts because, of course, there's always people that are upset, but they're continuing to move along, and they're doing things like, okay, people are upset, so give them something. Give them green space, put some trees on the corridor. So you're also playing with that marketing aspect as you're doing something that people feel like is being taken away from them for the betterment of the city. So this is a really, really interesting example to look at. And then to end off, I think it's interesting to look that this isn't just a European phenomenon. Things are happening here in a North American context, which is really exciting and really inspirational. We've had the opportunity to work with the city of Detroit for the last few years on doing their downtown plan. And this is a city with 7 to 9 lane corridors. They're spoke roads. They're historic spoke roads that go through the center of the city. And the city is very willing and very open now to thinking about this sort of future, and starting to think about how bikes can really be a vehicle for change, a fast-moving pedestrian for change in this city that needs it so badly. And we've been really excited to work with them, as well as the city of Akron, trying to also convert some of their larger corridors into more bicycle-friendly environments. So looking at a bigger street like this, a bigger intersection, saying, how can you do a protected intersection here with a piece of concrete here where cars have to do a larger turn around it, with protected cycle lanes and floating bus islands that protect bicycle users as the bus is coming in? Or how do we look at a smaller street where maybe we have to remove a whole bunch of parking, but this is a priority bicycle corridor. It's mainly painted lanes, but we can keep speeds slow. So applying a lot of those same philosophies that we're inspired by in Copenhagen and trying to apply that to a US context, and it's starting to gain ground. It's starting to be built and it's starting to gain ground. And for us, it's very exciting. So the next time somebody tells you, yeah, but this is Columbus, yeah, it's Detroit, just remember, like, everybody's saying that. This is the same thing we are hearing all over the world. We are fortunate enough in our work to be on all corners of the world giving these talks and having these conversations, and we're hearing the same thing from one contingent saying, yeah, but we can't, and then they're seeing their neighbor do it. And they're like, oh, wait, maybe these design principles actually make sense for us as well. And we have to remember, design is universal. Good design is universal. And from a bicycling perspective, we're talking about a connected network, safe infrastructure, reliable facilities, constructive communication and being proactive with your marketing communication, having a user-focused and an intuitive approach. So with that, I say thank you, and I guess we'll leave it to questions. Cool.
Beautiful lecture. I wish our entire city council and every traffic engineer in the city was here to witness this. But I have a, what do you think about the scooter tech? Is this something, not this issue of Columbus, not you scooters, not this issue of Columbus right now. Is this good because it'll get us protected lanes? Is this what it'll take, or is it a distraction?
I mean, the only answer I can give you is my own personal opinion. Us as a firm really we're behind docked systems. We're talking about docked bike share and scooters versus dockless, which is, the scooter systems we're seeing are all dockless, just like the Lime bikes, the dockless bikes. I really see a lot of the work that's going in super fast by these tech companies that are building scooters and bikes, dockless bikes, as sort of a disruptor of the market. It's what they're trying to do. I think there will be some benefits from a political level of saying, oh, people want this. I think there's a real damage and fear, or potential damage, to say that then citizen groups, merchant groups, and portions of the city will say, we don't want this stuff in our city because it's clogging all the sidewalks, it's being tossed in canals and alleyways and driveways. So I think there's a real danger with the dockless systems. I personally am very much in favor of these docked bike share systems because we've seen huge success. So being from Montreal, we built the first North American bike share system, which is the same system that's been rolled out in countless cities across the US and Canada. And our system has always been a docked system. It's a system that allows for management by the city so that they can rebalance it and grow it and sort of strategically have those conversations with shop owners and community boards and whatnot, so that they can make sure people aren't pissed off along the process, because that's a big problem, is that bikes are still seen as a nuisance and scooters are still seen as a nuisance by many. So any sidestep that we're taking to avoid the conversation of being a nuisance, I think is a beneficial one. So I would say there's some good in having more people chaotically riding around the city, but there's some potential damage there too. And so I would say go push docks more than dockless. Sure. I saw this hand first.
So just a question about social context. So in Columbus, we have a few reasonably well-designed separated bike lanes now, which still end up being relatively dangerous to ride on because drivers don't really know how to do this. Because you're constantly dodging cars that pull across them or parking them. How do you change that culture?
So sort of two pieces that I would say. I mean, first of all, three pieces. Culture does not change overnight, of course. It's going to be a messy process, of course, but the success that we're seeing in a lot of cities around the world, especially in North America, I would use Calgary in Canada as an example that kind of followed the Seville model. This network overnight concept, this minimum grid network, found a lot of success in that department for the fact that they chose 3 corridors through the downtown and said, we're going to do one type of design to keep it consistent, and we're going to do it as a pilot project and do tons of marketing around it, so that it wasn't just a bike lane that appeared here and a bike lane that appeared there, but it was essentially this transformation of their downtown as a pilot project that got very, very, very like high-level media attention. And then there was a lot of backlash against it. In the end, it did get voted in to a permanent network. And that, for them, they've seen a lot of success with, of course, with missteps and cultural grumbles along the way. The last point I would say to that is, this is also very much a Danish design perspective, and I know it's somewhat separate from the Dutch perspective in that the bidirectional, the two-way cycle track on the street should never be done in a North American context for at least 30 years, I would say. And if ever, really, because ultimately when we look, we recently ran a study in Montreal which has the largest number of protected on-street two-way cycle tracks in any North American city. And we do have a network, even though it's very bare bones and kind of starts and stops in certain places. And you can see the chaos that happens even at a functional intersection with two ways, because you're talking about 8 flows of bicycle traffic and every other type of transport on one corner. Whereas when you split them into unidirectional tracks, which are also wide enough for a slow rider and a fast rider, or 2 people to talk side by side on both sides of the street, first of all, you're separating those potential conflicts. So you're creating half the number of conflicts on both sides, which is good to not concentrate your conflict potential in one spot. But then what you're also doing is you're creating a system where the car driver should not have to be essentially, it's that same idea with intuitive design. The car driver should not need a manual to be told where the bike is. So the directional logic in North America is that we drive on the right side of the road. So logically, the bike would be on my right side because that's where the pedestrian is. So if we're building our cycle tracks to be in that same directionally logical place, then we're minimizing the potential for conflict. Whereas right now, I mean, we see this in Montreal and other cities around the world with the two-way cycle tracks. Drivers are furious and frustrated because they're like, I have to cross, look for car traffic both ways, then look for bike traffic both ways, then look for pedestrians. I don't know what I'm doing. And so we shouldn't make it harder for the people that are driving 2-ton boxes. So that's my thought.
Hi, Justin Goodwin, transportation planner in the city of Columbus. I work with unions. I'm interested in the early diagram you had showing the straight line approach that we have now for cars. It's easy for cars. And getting to this point of it's the zigzag, it's harder for cars. And you also noted we're at peak car. I think a lot of people would take issue with that. We're entering this trend of autonomy toward autonomy. So there's the great potential that we're going to be investing even more in single occupant vehicle or in some form of motorized transportation, investing even more infrastructure toward vehicles. So I'm interested if you guys have been thinking about what that means for design, bicycle-oriented design, when we don't know what the future of multimodal transportation is going to be yet, and everything is changing very rapidly.
A very, very fair and thoughtful question. I mean, when thinking about what technology is going to change on our streets, because it's going to happen one way or another, I think the perspective that we take, especially with regards to shared and autonomous vehicles, is that a lot of the push for this new technology is to change the paradigm of the single occupant vehicle. Because our streets are, it's not debatable that our streets are clogged because we have too many single people in their own car taking up space. So I think the autonomous vehicle movement and the ride-sharing movement and the bicycle infrastructure movement are all on the same page that the single occupant vehicle is the dinosaur that needs to be weeded out, that needs to be made difficult. So I think we can agree on that. The piece that I would say from the bicycle planning perspective is that when the autonomous vehicles take over the road and suddenly everybody's sharing and in fewer cars on the road, and suddenly we don't need parking because cars are constantly moving around and they're moving themselves around and people are sharing all those vehicles, we free up a lot of road space. So what happens then? So the advocate in me says, before autonomous vehicles come in, we need to go to the lowest hanging fruit, and that is eliminating car parking in a lot of places on street. In America, there is so much car parking, it makes my brain explode. And especially off street. And that's a whole other issue for urban designers and architects, of course. So the question is, this space that's already so inefficient, car parking, this space that's already so underutilized and underpaid for, but yet costs society so much, needs to be thought of today as something that can be converted to people and not cars. Because once automated vehicles take over the streets, if it does happen in the way people are saying it will, space will be free. And if there's free space, we're going to get back into induced demand again. We're going to get back into a situation where suddenly there's space that's free. So either we fill it with more cars and then get right back to where we are now, 50 years from now, where we have, oh my God, we have too many automated vehicles. We're at peak automated vehicle. Oh, we should put some bike infrastructure in, or we start doing this now, and we actually start redesigning our streets now.
So, bicycles are fairly prevalent in China. Why don't you talk about that? I mean, what is it that China and bicycles does you not deal with?
I'll first off say I'm no expert in China, so I'm not going to pretend to be. But secondly, you look at the trends in China in comparison to the trends in Europe and the more recent trends in North America, and China's done the opposite. I mean, there were a lot of bikes in China, and the modal shares have just diminished in Chinese cities in the last 30 years. They've been building a ton of roadway infrastructure. Have you seen these YouTube videos with the craziest highway overpasses in the world that have been built in the last 10 years in China? I mean, I think a lot of the road construction that's been happening in China today is what we saw 40, 50 years ago here. And so I think that, again, not claiming to be an expert in China at all, but I think that definitely would have contributed to fewer bicycle users. Thank you.